Welcome to the June Community IT Innovators webinar series. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on the latest cloud strategies. My name is Johan Hammerstrom, and I'm the President and CEO of Community IT and the moderator for this series, as well as the presenter for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about our company. Community IT is a 100% employee-owned company. Our team of almost 40 staff is dedicated to helping nonprofit organizations advance their missions through the effective use of technology. We are technology experts, and we were recently named the top Washington, D.C.-based managed services provider by MSP Mentor. Throughout the webinar today, I will be doing my best to respond to your questions. So if you have any questions or comments, please use the GoToWebinar chat feature to send them to me. And so, with that out of the way, this is the point where I usually introduce the speaker, but today that's going to be me, and I will be talking to you about the latest in cloud strategies. So really quickly, just want to start with an overview of what we're going to be discussing today. I want to begin by defining what is meant by cloud, talk a little bit about some of the strategic design considerations that need to go into any sort of technology planning process, but specifically those related to cloud hosting and cloud infrastructure. Talk about how those considerations can lead your organization to have an effective strategy around cloud hosting and cloud migration. And then we'll get into, once that's out of the way, we'll talk a little bit more about the trends that we're seeing in IaaS, and I'll define what that means later in the webinar. And I'll talk a little bit about the SaaS trends, what we're seeing with SaaS. So let's start by defining what we mean by cloud. And I think now in 2017, we're fully past the Gartner hype cycle as it relates to cloud and what cloud means. It's probably between 5 and 8 years ago that the term cloud really began to get traction, and people started to think about how the cloud, quote unquote, could help them with their technology needs. So let's talk a little bit about what is meant by cloud, and I think that really helps us understand the cloud landscape today. So I like to think of the cloud as a continuum, that there isn't a place out there called the cloud, but rather cloud is sort of a concept that you should keep in mind as you're thinking about where to host your data and your IT infrastructure. The first step along the way is on-premise. Now, obviously, this is not the cloud, but on-premise refers to anything you have at your office, whether it's your headquarters or one of your field offices. On-premise is servers or other equipment that you have on site, and specifically data and applications. The data center, typically also known as a co-location center or a colo, is a place where lots of people host their servers, and you've probably seen pictures of data centers. Maybe you've seen them on TV shows, and it's just a long row of racks of servers. It's a big building, typically out in the middle of nowhere, filled with servers, and it's possible to host your data there. Let's talk about IaaS. That's infrastructure as a service. And infrastructure as a service represents something of an improvement over the data center. So the data center is an improvement over hosting your data on premise because you don't have to worry about things like typically the power going out, the internet going out. Those are things that you have to worry about on some level when you're hosting your data on premise. If the power or the internet to your building goes out, your data is not going to be accessible. But data centers are designed to provide incredibly high levels of uptime, and they do that through having multiple power sources coming into the building. They have their own power generators. They typically have multiple data lines coming into the building as well. So the data center can be a good hosting option if you need greater availability than can be provided on premise. But you still have to purchase the hardware, and you still have to host that hardware and manage it and maintain it. Infrastructure as a service gets rid of those requirements. Instead of purchasing physical hardware, you're basically purchasing virtual instances of hardware, virtual servers, if you will, and managing those servers as if they were real. And finally, the ultimate in cloud, and typically when people talk about cloud, this is usually what they're referring to, software as a service. And that's any kind of solution where you are purchasing the software as a provided service, and you don't even need to manage the servers that the software is running on. So your infrastructure will likely contain elements of many or all of these different hosting options. And so it's very possible, in fact, it's often prudent to set up your network infrastructure in such a way that you're using a combination or a hybrid of on-premise, data center hosted IaaS and SaaS. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. That'll be a main focus of this webinar, to look really closely at where it makes sense to host your different services. And we'll talk in much more detail about specific solutions that are available, both IaaS and SaaS. So in terms of designing your architecture, in terms of thinking about where you should be hosting your data and your applications, what are the main considerations that you need to keep in mind? Cost, obviously. Cost is a significant factor. As we saw on the previous slide, on-premise is not as good a solution as data center hosted, but it has the advantage of being less expensive. You're not renting a rack in a data center. And likewise, IaaS tends to be a more expensive solution than hosting in the data center. Although, and one of the big benefits of IaaS is that the costs are incurred on a monthly basis, spread out over time, rather than a large upfront cost of having to invest in a lot of server infrastructure. And in fact, this has been something that's really driven the startup industry over the last 5 to 10 years, is the ability of startups to set up their infrastructure using IaaS and then to scale it based on the number of customers that they have. So cost is not just about, the cost consideration isn't just about how much it costs, but also when the costs are incurred. Functionality is important as you're looking at different solutions. You really should be aware of the functionalities of those different solutions, and I'll get into more detail on what this means using some specific examples. But it's always important to balance the cost and the functionality. You need to think about availability. So how available does the system need to be? And I think this is one that people sometimes get tripped up on a little bit. Oftentimes people will say, well, it can never go down. My system needs to be available all the time. And that's understandable. But at the same time, a system that's 100% available is also going to be incredibly expensive. And so you really need to balance your availability needs against the cost that you're willing to pay. Availability essentially becomes a business cost. And so you really need to do a cost-benefit analysis. How much time can we really stand to be down? And obviously that conversation can't happen in a vacuum. If 8 hours of downtime a year can be had for $1,000 a year, let's say, just random hypothetical numbers here, and 2 hours of downtime a year can be had for $10,000, maybe those additional 6 hours are worth $9,000 to your organization, but maybe they're not. So it's important to keep in mind the availability requirements, and you need to define those ahead of time, but you also need to be realistic, about what you should be spending for availability, and also the impact that availability can have on functionality. Security is critical, and as you're thinking about where to host your data, you really need to think about the security considerations involved. Early on in the world of cloud, there were obviously a lot of natural concerns that people had with the security of their data if it's hosted out in the cloud. And I think 5-6 years down the road, it's safe to say that data in the cloud is generally just as, if not more secure than data that's stored on premise. And in fact, with today's threat landscape, you could probably make the argument that you're adding more risks by hosting your data on premise. And I can talk a little bit more about that when we get into the specific solutions. But it's not a given. And there are organizations, depending on the work that they do, who are wary of having their data hosted with a cloud hosting provider. And that's understandable as well. There are legal issues involved. And we work with organizations who are very concerned about their data being subpoenaed by the government, for example, and them not being aware of it. And it's important to realize that if you're hosting data with cloud hosted provider, that data can be subpoenaed by the government, and the hosting provider doesn't necessarily need to let you know. And in fact, in a lot of cases, the government will request that they don't inform you unless there's a special provision in the terms of service. So that's another aspect of security that organizations need to be mindful of. So these are the main considerations that should be kept in mind when you're thinking about where to host your data and your applications. So let's go into design strategy. So once you've sort of mapped out those major considerations, the strategy for developing for your cloud hosting needs to start with your identifying your business needs. So that's what needs does your business have in terms of the work that your organization does for availability? What needs does it have for collaboration? There are a wide variety of business needs. And again, I'll talk about those in more detail when we get to specific solutions. You want to evaluate your options. And I'm going to go through some of the major options for basic productivity as well as some other major sort of common functions that most nonprofit organizations have later on. And typically, in some cases, you're only going to have 2 or 3 options. The nature of cloud is such that there's been a lot of consolidation over the last 5 to 7 years. Excuse me. And you're probably better off just looking at the major choices available to you rather than trying to track down 6 or 7 different options. As is often the case in the technology industry, early on when a field is young, there tend to be a lot of entrants into the field, and then over time there tends to be a lot of consolidation, and that's certainly something we've seen in the world of cloud. You want to be open to and in fact actively consider a hybrid approach. There are advantages to having everything in the cloud, but I think a strategy that just says prima facie right off the bat, we want to go cloud no matter what, is not necessarily going to meet all of your business needs and doesn't necessarily take into account all of the considerations that you have in terms of cost, functionality, availability. And I think most organizations use the cloud wisely and end up coming up with a strategy that has some services in the cloud and some services still on premise. I think this is not so much the case anymore, and we certainly expect over the next 3 to 5 years for there to be a continued migration outward to the cloud. But you don't want to. The cloud in and of itself doesn't have sort of an absolute positive value. It really depends on a lot of these other factors. And a hybrid approach is absolutely feasible. And part of that hybrid approach is looking at integration. How do you integrate between the different cloud services that you have? And this becomes kind of a new and unique sort of special challenge. Back in the day, so to speak, when you had a lot of your data and applications on premise, you had more control and more access to integrating the data and the applications. And now with cloud services, a lot of that is abstracted or less available to organizations. And so that question of how to integrate starts to become more important. So you want to keep that in mind as you're putting together your cloud strategy. All right. So now that we've kind of gone through some of those basics, let's talk a little bit about IaaS, infrastructure as a service. So there's two major players in the infrastructure as a service space, and there are many other players. And on the next slide, I'm going to talk about some of the other ones. But the 800 million pound gorilla is Amazon Web Services, also known as AWS. And this is something that Amazon started building out, I believe it was in 2005. It's been around for a really long time, and Jeff Bezos gets a lot of credit for being a real visionary in terms of this service offering, and it's responsible for a significant portion of Amazon's profits now. And it's also Amazon is also its biggest customer. So Amazon obviously runs all of its services on AWS infrastructure. But you might be surprised to learn that other companies use AWS as well. In fact, one of Amazon's biggest competitors, Netflix, hosts all of their videos in AWS. So Netflix made early on and has continued to make a business decision to host their entire technology infrastructure on infrastructure as a service rather than building out their own data centers and provisioning and managing their own hardware. So we're kind of getting to a point where there are very few players anymore in terms of building out and managing data centers. Amazon's one of the major ones, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. Those are kind of the major data center managers and owners at this point. So Amazon is the dominant provider. It's by far the most established. It's the most widely used. As a result, there's always in technologies network effects. So if you can capture a large percentage of the market, you're going to start to see a lot of additional, benefits, which include just having more integration, more third-party services, such as backup and management platforms that integrate with Amazon Web Services. And in some cases, you can get more aggressive pricing with Amazon Web Services. So for anyone who's not familiar, Amazon Web Services has a couple of different pricing models, and you can purchase what are known as reserved instances, where you basically just buy a server with a certain specification, a certain amount of processing power, a certain amount of memory, a certain amount of storage capacity, and you can pay a flat monthly fee to have that server available to you. And if you need to add more servers, you just spin those up and pay a flat monthly fee for those servers. So that's one approach, and that's typically what we see with a lot of the nonprofits that we work with. But you can also use a utility pricing model where you are paying on a per gigabyte stored, per gigabyte memory used, per megabyte bandwidth used, per megabyte memory used model. So if you have a server that's doing a lot and processing a lot of data or sending a lot of data over the internet, you'll pay more. But if it's just sitting there not doing anything, you'll pay less. So for some organizations and some business needs, the utility model works a lot better than the reserved instance model. So Amazon's great. We've had a lot of great experience with using Amazon, both at Community IT as well as with the organizations that we work with. It's gotten to the point where it does an incredible amount, but it's also become more complicated. And as a result, we're starting to see more and more sort of third-party management services or management companies that will manage AWS for you. The other big player in this space is obviously Microsoft and their Azure platform, which in sort of typical Microsoft fashion, they were a little late to the game with. They really started promoting Azure about 5 years ago, so anywhere from 5 to 7 years after Amazon. And so Amazon really got a head start in this space. But also in typical Microsoft fashion, they've put together a really, really nice offering. And so we've also used Azure, both ourselves at Community IT as well as helping our customers use it. And it's a great service. From a functionality standpoint, there's a lot of parity between Amazon Web Services and Microsoft Azure. So, there's not a huge distinction between the two, I guess, in terms of what they do. There are subtle differences, and it's important to look at both if you're considering IaaS. But Microsoft Azure is just as robust and capable as Amazon Web Services for a lot of what small and mid-sized nonprofit organizations will do. Some of the advantages that Azure might have. First, it's integrated with the Microsoft ecosystem. So Microsoft has built out a lot of integration points between its on-premise software and Azure, or between Office 365, which we'll talk about in a minute, and Azure. And so, again, in typical Microsoft fashion, it might be easier to integrate your Azure instances with your on-premise Microsoft server farm if you still have Microsoft on-premise. So there's some advantages there. Really tight integration. They're moving towards setting up native backups. So for example, if you have a SQL server on premise, let's say you've got Razor's Edge, you're hosting it at your office, and you're running it, the backend, on Microsoft SQL, there's now the ability to do a direct backup from that SQL server into Azure, into your Azure instance. So it's those sorts of things that Microsoft is going to continue to develop and make easier, that there just isn't. There are other ways to do that, provide that same functionality with AWS, but I think Microsoft is really trying to, make that a lot simpler, to manage. And that's an example right there of a great hybrid approach where you're still running Razor's Edge on premise. It may make a lot of sense for you to do that, but now you can, maybe have some kind of replication or backup into infrastructure as a service out in the cloud. The second advantage that Azure provides is a $5,000 annual credit. And that's something that Microsoft is providing for nonprofit organizations. And so if you're a qualified nonprofit, you can apply for that grant. And if it's approved, then you get $5,000 in annual credit, which in many cases is not an insubstantial amount of money. So I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but let's just say you reserved a $500 a month server. That's not going to, you're not going to be able to host your entire network in the cloud for $500 a month. But let's say you want to put one server or two servers in the cloud, $500 a month may cover that. Well, this $5,000 annual credit pays for almost all of that. And so you're really able to, especially for smaller organizations, it provides a lot of flexibility in moving out to the cloud. So that's an advantage. And Microsoft also, in our experience, is very responsive to the needs of business customers and continues to kind of build out the service and continues to develop it to meet the needs of smaller businesses. Not that Amazon isn't. That's something that Amazon is doing as well. So these are the two major players, but there are others in the space. And in fact, Google Cloud is one that you may have heard of. And so I was kind of curious, like, well, what would happen if I like doing these Google searches where you just type in a couple words and then see what the top searches are. So I typed in why Google Cloud, and you can see here the top 4 things that people are searching for. Why Google Cloud Platform? Why Google Cloud is better than AWS? Why Google Cloud over AWS? Why Google Cloud versus AWS? So clearly, like I said before, AWS is the 800-pound gorilla that all of the other IaaS options are comparing themselves against. But let's try to answer this question. Why might you choose Google Cloud over AWS or Azure? So here are a couple different options. Let's start with the Google Cloud Platform. As far as I can tell, we have not used Google Cloud, also known as the Google Cloud Compute, earlier in its life. And based on our research, there are some situations in which using Google Cloud would be less expensive. Based on what we've looked at, those typically are situations in which you're using an extensive amount of computing power. And so if you don't have sort of computing intensive needs, it's unlikely that Google Cloud is going to be less expensive for you. There are some advantages that Google Cloud has in edge content distribution. So if you have some video content that you're streaming, significant amount of video or audio content, some media, it's possible that Google Cloud would be a better platform. If you're already using Google, if you're using the G Suite, which we'll talk about in a little bit, then Google Cloud might have some better integration points. But in general, in the industry, it's definitely sort of kind of late to the party, and also Google has been a little bit unclear about where they're taking this. Are they trying to compete with AWS and Azure? Are they trying to build something a little bit different that is more suited for developers or massive machine learning, or integrating with their core business of search? It's a little bit unclear right now. So we're kind of in a hold right now in terms of recommending Google Cloud, but it's certainly something that we're keeping an eye on. The next option I want to talk about is Rackspace. And Rackspace is a good example of Rackspace basically started off as a data center reseller. So 10, 15 years ago, you could buy servers and either ship them to Rackspace or just buy them from Rackspace. And they were your servers, you owned them, but they would set them up in their data center outside Chicago, and you never had to go there. And if they ever needed work, Rackspace would do that for you. But you basically had your own physical server in Rackspace's data center. And then once IaaS started to become more and more popular, Rackspace started to offer that solution as well. They are clearly much, much smaller than Amazon, and so they don't have the same level of functionality that Amazon has. They can't offer the same pricing that Amazon offers, and so our sense is they're potentially getting squeezed a little bit by the bigger players. That creates potentially some options for more flexible terms of service. And so organizations that have specific requirements, I talked a little bit earlier about some of the legal needs that organizations have in terms of their data being subpoenaed, you're more likely to get some concessions from Rackspace than you would from Amazon Web Services. So that's one potential advantage of going with someone like Rackspace. The other interesting pivot that Rackspace is now making is that they're actually a front end for AWS. And so Rackspace clearly has really strong customer service, customer facing capabilities that they've used over the years in reselling these boxes out of their data center. And now they're sort of applying those business capabilities to Amazon Web Services. So if you're wanting to use Amazon Web Services, but you go to AWS and you try to set up a server and you're immediately confused, which happens because if you haven't seen it, there's a ton of options. It can be very confusing if you don't know what you're doing. And if you just want to kind of set up a server, it's not always obvious or easy to do that just going to the Amazon Web Services site. And so you can go to Rackspace instead and work with someone there who's an expert in AWS and can set that all up for you and even manage it for you. So they're basically becoming a reseller for AWS. And there are many other firms that are doing this right now. So Rackspace is just one of the more sort of prominent examples of this. And then a third one that came up as I was doing some research, I just wanted to see if there were any other options, is a group called Interroute that's based in Europe. And so that could be a good option if you want to, if you need to be headquartered in Europe, if you want your virtual servers to be headquartered there. It's faster in Europe, so they've done a lot to build out a European infrastructure, and also are much more flexible in terms of the legal contracts that they would sign. So it's possible that you're nervous about hosting your data with Microsoft or with AWS. Interroute might be a good option. So this is sort of an illustration of what's out there, just to let you know that there are other options besides Microsoft and Amazon. That being said, for the majority of organizations, Microsoft and Amazon are probably going to be the best options. All right, well, let's switch gears here and talk a little bit about software as a service. So as I had mentioned before, with infrastructure as a service, you're still in the position of having to manage servers. So that means you need to make sure they have antivirus. You need to make sure that they have good perimeter protection, whether it's a firewall or some other type of intrusion detection system. You need to make sure that they're patched, that they're being backed up. So there's a lot of responsibilities that you have with infrastructure as a service that you may not want, honestly. And maybe that creates a level of overhead that may be more than you need. Now, the flip side of that, of course, is that you have a lot more granular control over your data and your application. And so that's sort of the balance or the trade-off between infrastructure as a service and software as a service. So let's start by talking about basic productivity. So in basic productivity, I mean those computer tasks that everybody in every organization needs to be able to do. So that's email, potentially chatting, putting together Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentations, slideshow-based presentations. These are what is meant by basic productivity. And there are basically two options. And there's really kind of only one for a lot of organizations. But those two options are Office 365 and G Suite. And the G Suite, formerly known as Google Apps, has been rebranded by Google into G Suite. So what are some of the differences between Office 365, broadly speaking? I think in general, most of you are familiar with the user interface differences. You've probably used Gmail either personally or professionally. You've probably used Outlook at some point. Those are very different email systems. Those are the email systems of these two solutions. You've probably used Microsoft Word or Excel for your spreadsheet. You probably have at some point in time used Google Word or Google Docs or Google Sheets. So those are sort of the end user differences. Let's talk a little bit about the differences on a business level. So one of the big advantages of Office 365 in our experience is the enterprise focus. So Microsoft, their business depends on their selling software to other businesses. And so they're very incented and focused on making sure that that software is going to meet the needs of businesses. And so they spend a lot of time talking to their customers and incorporating that feedback into the development of their product. And anyone who's used Office 365 for over 5 years has seen a pretty remarkable improvement in the quality of the software and the cloud hosting in that time. And we fully expect that to continue. So Microsoft, when Steve Ballmer stepped down and Satya Nadella took over as the CEO, he immediately shifted the organization into a cloud-first focus. And over the past few years since he's been in charge, they've really done a lot of amazing work to build out and mature their cloud offering in Office 365. So it's enterprise focused. It's seen continuous improvement. And in fact, they're improving it on a monthly basis. Every month, it seems, they're rolling out new features, new functionalities, and improving the stability of the system. One of the real selling points of Office 365 is the advanced functionality that comes from the Office suite. And so Outlook is a very advanced and sophisticated program. Microsoft Word, it's an advanced program. I think the best example is Excel, which is a great tool for particularly a lot of accounting departments, but people throughout the organization use those tools. So it has real advanced functionality. And they continue to expand Office 365 with new features. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. And there's a growing third-party integration. So I mentioned earlier when talking about AWS about the network effects that sort of accrue to the dominant player in the space. It's being kind of a defining feature of the technology business. It's starting to happen, I think, with Office 365 as it picks up speed and gains more and more users and more businesses are going to Office 365. More and more third parties are now integrating with Office 365. And so it's becoming a lot easier if you have Office 365 to integrate with your other solutions. Now, may sound like I'm really kind of pushing towards Office 365, I will say in our experience that I would guess 80-85% of the time, it probably is the best choice for a nonprofit organization that is functioning essentially in an office environment, is doing office-based work. It's almost always the best choice. Not always, though. And there are certainly cases where an organization would be better suited going with the G Suite, going with Google. I think one of the best examples is in education. Google has done a lot to create tools for the educational environment, and I know a lot of schools use G Suite and are very happy with it. So that's one example, but there are others as well. And I don't mean to be prescriptive at all in terms of what solution you should use for basic productivity. Some of the things to keep in mind with the G Suite, the Google interface is very different, but it's also one that a lot of people prefer, and especially younger staff. One of the things we've noticed is that younger staff tend to prefer the Google interface over the Microsoft interface. I will say that in our experience, the development of the G Suite has really stalled out, and they've added a few new features here and there, but in our experience, it really sort of plateaued probably almost 5 years ago, and they've not made significant improvements to the applications themselves in that time. In my experience, Gmail works now the way it did 5 or 6 years ago. Google Docs works now the way it did 5 or 6 years ago. Not that that's a bad thing, but I think it does reflect the business incentives of Google, which is a search-based, their revenue comes from Google search. Microsoft's revenue comes from Office 365 licenses. And I think when you look at that, you can see the incentives that are driving what those businesses focus on. One of the things that G Suite has a major advantage over Office 365 with is managing Google properties. So if you're using Google Analytics, if you're using YouTube, if you're using Google AdWords, all the management of those different Google utilities or tools is closely integrated with the G Suite. And so we've actually seen a lot of organizations implement both Office 365 and set up a G Suite domain just so that they can have a way of managing things like analytics and YouTube that are tied to the organization and not an individual's personal Gmail account. And then there's also certain platforms that G Suite integrates with more effectively. So one of the things I want to talk a little bit more about Office 365 and specifically how confusing it can be. So this is the my apps landing page for our company. And when I go here, I have a lot of options of different things I can do in Office 365. And it can be a little confusing because there's a lot you can do. And it's so confusing that there's a company called Two to Lead, which put together this chart called When to Use What. And they've actually spoken at Microsoft's flagship Ignite conference every year. Microsoft is throwing so much out there that they themselves are starting to get confused about when to use what tool for what purpose. And so this chart, and the links are here, is meant to kind of guide you in the right direction. And this has spawned a cottage industry of other companies doing the same thing. So this is maybe not the dark side, but one of the things you should keep in mind if you're going with Office 365, you now have a ton of tools that your staff are going to have access to. And you really need to think about what you want to, you can turn all of these things off. So all of these apps you see here can be hidden from me. And many of them probably should be. I probably shouldn't, be wandering around in Planner maybe, I don't know. But you want to be deliberate in terms of what applications you give your organization access to. And some organizations, that means 3. They're going to have Bamboo HR, and they're going to have their email and their calendar, and that's it. Don't want them to have access to anything else. Or in other organizations, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I want to give everyone access to everything and just see what kind of emerges. That really depends on the business needs of the organization, the culture of the organization. So you've got that option. But as I said, there's a lot of different complicated ways of looking at what Office 365 gives you. And you want to make sure that you're aware of the options and being deliberate about which ones you're going to be using. Most people get into Office 365 with the intention of using email. And then from there, you can sort of spread out and use the other uh, applications that are in Office 365. So that's basic productivity, but there are software as a service options for managing finances and resources, your constituents, and your identity and cloud solutions, and much, much more. So almost every business function that your organization has probably has a software as a service solution associated with it. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the major options, but this is by no means exhaustive. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So here are some of the major options that are out there for cloud hosting. So interestingly enough, um, the the financial management and enterprise resource management um, applications are among the most sophisticated, but also the most well established in any organization. So whether you're a small organization using QuickBooks or a larger organization using Dynamics or something even larger than that, it's a solution that has been around for a long time and is still primarily an on-premise solution. And it's been interesting to see how long it's taken for there to be a cloud-based option in the financial and enterprise resource management and planning space. Two of the ones that we've seen recently are Intact. We've seen a number of clients starting to use that solution. And then Microsoft's rolled out Dynamics 365. And I don't have time to go into the details of what that means, but our partner Build Consulting wrote a fantastic blog post about Dynamics 365. So if you're interested in learning more about it, you can go to thisisbuild.com and you'll see the blog post there. So those are two. There are many others. There's QuickBooks Online. I think one of the reasons that it's been difficult for organizations to move their financial management into the cloud is that it's a very process heavy function in the organization, and the process in general is very closely tied to the specific functionality of the software. And so you may have some financial management processes that you have to follow in your organization that are heavily dependent on the way that QuickBooks or the way that Dynamics on premise works, and you can't just migrate all your data over to Intact without rethinking a lot of your processes. So the process and platform or application are very closely connected in those cases. Fundraising is similar in many ways. Fundraising, kind of the flip side of financial management for a lot of nonprofits, and constituent relationship management. The two big players in that space, clearly, Razor's Edge, although Razor's Edge NXT is kind of a different animal from the traditional Razor's Edge that a lot of organizations are still using on premise. It's Blackbaud's attempt to move Razor's Edge out into the cloud. I can't speak to how effective it's been. I can't speak to how well it would work for your organization, but just to say that that's their strategy. And then Salesforce, you've probably heard of, and they've made a major push over the last 5, 6, 7 years to have nonprofit organizations use their platform as a CRM. And then finally, identity and single sign-on. Identity management is basically the management of the authorized users in your organization and managing their access to data and applications. And this is something that 10 years ago was all handled through Microsoft's Active Directory. You may recall you log onto your computer using your username and password. You're logging onto a specific domain, and that gave you access to email and files and all of that. Now that you have all of your software and your data out in the cloud, how do you manage access to that? And it's becoming unwieldy to have you know, um, if you have 5 different cloud, hosting services that you're using, now your staff have 5 different username and passwords that they have to remember. And when you have someone start or leave, you have to remember to set them up with an account on each of those 5 different services. And imagine now the challenges of doing that with 10 different services rather than 5. And imagine the complexity of managing that for 50 or 60 staff. So identity management and single sign-on, which are kind of two sides of the same coin, is the growing solution space to deal with that problem. And the 3 major options that we've run into and have used and have experience with are Office 365. They, of course, Microsoft has its own single sign-on solution. It costs extra. So if you're getting Office 365 E1 as a nonprofit, you would have to pay extra to use the single sign-on. And I don't recall, I know that for a while there was no nonprofit option. You just had to pay the full regular business price. And I don't know if that's changed or not. Okta is another solution that provides single sign-on, and Okta has nonprofit pricing. I believe they provide up to 25 licenses at no charge for qualified nonprofits, and OneLogin is a third solution. It's probably a space where you're going to want to go with one of these 3 options, simply because they're going to integrate with the most services, and that's really going to help to define who wins in this identity management and single sign-on space. Because if you're working with a solution that only integrates with half of your cloud services, it's not going to be as useful to you. We actually did a webinar a couple months ago. Our CTO, Matthew Eshelman, did a webinar on single sign-on, and it was excellent. So if you have any questions or you want to learn a little bit more about that, I would encourage you to go back and look at that webinar. All right. So it's kind of an abrupt end, but don't worry. Got time for Q&As, and I've got a couple questions that came in already, so I plan to get to those in a minute if you want to stick around. And feel free to chat over any additional questions that you have. I did want to mention first that we'll have another webinar next month. Every month, third Wednesday of every month, we have our free webinar open to all, so please share with others if you find it of value. When you exit out of the webinar, there will be a survey that we'd like you to fill out, and it really helps us to continue to provide you with the webinars that are useful to you and continue to meet the needs of the nonprofit sector. Next month, Matthew Eshelman will go back to our favorite topic this year, security. And this is actually one of the most popular webinar of all time was about crafting IT security policy. And that was from 3 years ago. So we thought, you know what? The security landscape has changed dramatically in the last 3 years. We really need to do a refresh of that webinar and really, come back and revisit this topic of crafting IT security policy. So I encourage you to join us next month for that topic. If you missed the webinar, if you can't make it, if you're on, hopefully you're on vacation that week, we do record all of our webinars, and we make the webinars available on our YouTube channel, and we make the slides available on our SlideShare account. All right, well, let's get to some questions here. Thank you for everyone who's sent in a question. So someone asked, can you talk about the CSP model Microsoft is using and how it affects the customer experience? Great question. And part of the reason that I love it is it gives me a chance to talk about CSP, because I think many of you may not know what that is. CSP stands for Cloud Cloud Solutions or Cloud Services Partner. The Cloud Services Partner is someone who is basically reselling Microsoft's services. So Microsoft's traditional model of selling its software is to use what's known as the channel. They call it the channel. And it's basically people that are working closely with Microsoft to resell Microsoft software. And that was the model they used for years and years when they were just selling, shrink-wrapped software. It's the model they were using when they sold licenses of software, and it's the model that they're now going to use for reselling cloud solutions, cloud services. The reason that they're using a channel-based model, or the reason that they're going with cloud services partners, is because Microsoft doesn't want to get involved with advising you on how to set up and use Office 365. They want to sell you Office 365, but then if you need help setting it up, managing it, using it effectively, that's not the business that Microsoft is in. So their model is to actually have these cloud services providers or partners resell the software for them. And that way, if the customer has any questions, they go to the CSP rather than to Microsoft directly. And the CSP model, there's a lot of sort of financial incentives built into it that incent CSPs to use it. So that's the CSP model. It affects the customer's. It's a benefit in some ways because it gives you someone that you can call and that can help you with your problems. It's been a challenge with nonprofits, and I've talked to a number of people about this because the CSP model doesn't work with nonprofit organizations. Because for nonprofits, if you're going to use Office 365, you go to TechSoup, you get qualified as a nonprofit, and then TechSoup essentially resells the software licenses to you at a deep discount. TechSoup is not officially a CSP. They're acting as a CSP in terms of reselling the licenses, but they're not set up to act as a CSP in terms of providing that support. And so there's a bit of a disconnect, I guess, between the model that Microsoft is using in the for-profit space and the model that they're using in the nonprofit space. And I think this is something that clearly Microsoft and TechSoup are both aware of and are discussing and working on a solution for. I think in the meantime, as a nonprofit, your best bet is, absolutely by all means, continue to get that deeply discounted license from TechSoup, but then see if you can find an IT support provider that's willing to support, your Office 365 deployment and provide you with advice, help you with the planning of it and the support of it. So that's CSP. The next question, can you talk about Dynamics? This was from earlier. What do you think about it? And again, I can't say a whole lot about Dynamics. I would just refer you to the blog post on Build's website. I will say that it is different from the on-premise Dynamics, and it's not just a cloud-based version of the on-premise Dynamics. It does some things differently. It's going to require some adaptation and migration, much in the same way as Razor's Edge NXT. If we use Google as our email server, could we just use the cloud storage that they provide? Is that logical? Is it safe? I would say yes, you could. It's logical in the sense that there's a natural integration. So, and I'm going to assume in this question that cloud storage refers to Google Drive. So there's a natural integration between the G Suite email or Gmail for organizations and the G Drive or Google Drive for organizations. And so there's a lot of close integration where if you're composing an email and you want to attach a document, you click attach and one of the options is pull it from my Google Drive and you can just pull it right in. Works very seamlessly. You can click on the app, the drop-down app menu, click on Drive if you're logged into your email, and it'll automatically take you into your Drive. So there's very close integration. It's the same interface. The downside is that the G Drive is not really set up to function in the way that most people expect. So most people expect a file server, which is what many of us have used for decades now in our office environments. And so we expect there to be a centralized, anonymous, source of documents that doesn't belong to any one person and that's managed by a central administrator. And some people have permission to those documents and some don't, and we can go there and work on documents and share them with other people. That's not at all how the G Drive works. G Drive is, you basically have a set of folders and files that belong to you that you can share out to other people, and there's no centralized repository essentially. And I think we've run into all kinds of challenges with shifting from one paradigm to the other. So that's a huge factor that you really, as an organization, really need to think about before you before you commit to moving to the G Drive. There are other options. So, for example, Box, which is a great example of something that is cloud-based, but also functions a little bit more like a traditional file server, and also integrates with the G Suite. So there are third-party options to consider. Let's see here. Can you? Oh, great. Interested in. So our current system for managing digital images is not scalable, and I'm looking for something that does much more. And then also, can you talk about image and video management? Great question. Thank you for asking this. None of these solutions that I've talked about today are necessarily what we call digital asset management. So that's video and photo management is a whole class of solutions called digital asset management. Now, Office 365 has a sort of video channel that you can upload videos to. So, for example, we record all of our staff meetings at Community IT, and if staff can't attend the meeting for whatever reason, those recordings are uploaded to Office 365. It works great. It's a huge improvement over the file back in the day when we put them on the file server and someone had to download it, and it streams well. It works really well. For that solution, it works great. If on the other hand, we had a ton of video content that was a core part of our business, I don't think it would be, I can't speak to it, but I would be suspicious. I would be skeptical about using the Office 365 video system to manage those video files. So I think at that point, you're kind of looking at, and this is just going to be rough ballpark figures, sort of tiers of solutions. So you can start with, there's free solutions out there, and people use things like SmugMug. You can use Google Photos to manage photos and videos. So there's options for doing that. I think the caution I would offer is that if you're using a solution that's free, the functionality is going to be very limited, and in general, the business need that people have with videos and images is to be able to retrieve those images when they need them, to be able to use them quickly, to manage things like attribution. If they're working with independent photographers, they need to manage the royalties that are going out, to those photographers. That ends up becoming a very complex business process, and you can certainly sort of create a whole lot of overhead, around a simple solution like Google Photos to help you manage that. But generally, one person in the organization needs to own that. And if that person leaves, what then happens, to the management of those assets? So that's kind of at the free level, and then you can kind of go up into the $5,000 to $6,000 range, and you can look at, there are other solutions. I think Resource Space is one of them. There are a few others. And then you can go up from Photo Shelter, I think is another one. Then you can go up from there into a $15,000 to $20,000 range, where you start to get really much more, sophisticated cloud hosting solutions that allow you to manage all those aspects of digital asset management more effectively, that will integrate with the Adobe, Photo Suite products more effectively. So I think, unfortunately, I'm kind of dodging a little bit, but I think that the end result is, or the what I would say in conclusion to this is, start with an understanding of how central or critical this need is to your organization. And if it's really vital, if it's central to what you do, it's really worth looking into more advanced solutions that can provide it. If it's more like, we take pictures of our staff events that we do throughout the year, and we just want a place where we can store them, it's possible that Office 365 and or the G Suite would give you that ability. I hope that helps. let's see here. We've got a few more questions, and we're at 5 o'clock, so I'm going to go for 5 more minutes and answer a few more questions here before ending the webinar. Someone asked the advantages and disadvantages of moving to SharePoint. Oh, this could be its own webinar. In fact, I think we did a few webinars on SharePoint last year, and you can find those on our website and on our YouTube channel. Everything I said about the G Drive applies to SharePoint as well. People have expectations around how file management and file storage is going to work based on file servers that we've used for a long time. And unfortunately, SharePoint doesn't work that way either. It can sort of be set up to work in a way that's similar to a traditional file server, but it's not really meant for that. It's meant to be a more advanced online document management solution. And so there's a lot of design work that can be done around building out metadata and doing more advanced, sort of sophisticated document management tasks. So it can become difficult for people to use because it doesn't work. It's not as straightforward or as easy to use as a traditional file server. It's included with Office 365, so that's a benefit. If you can get it working right, it works incredibly well. We use SharePoint at Community IT, and I'm very, very happy with it. And as someone who used and tried to implement SharePoint off and on for the better part of 15 years, I was very skeptical, just to be honest, early on that it was going to work, just because I had had so many bad experiences with SharePoint over the years. But I will say our team did a fantastic job in setting the right expectations, in listening to the organization, and in setting it up in a way that really met the needs of all of the departments and teams that we have here. So, and I've seen that at other organizations as well. So it can be done, but I think there's some, you need to exercise caution. And finally, team drives. There's a question: doesn't team drives, which was made available on April 5th, provide a solution similar to a file server? That's a great question. It might. I think in our experience with the G Suite, we've found that the new things that they roll out don't always work the way that we expect them to. So I don't want to say one way or another if that's a good solution or not. So that's a good question. I'm curious now myself if Team Drives maybe addresses some of those issues. I will say that in general, getting file storage in the cloud to behave just like an on-premise file server is kind of a holy grail that no one ever found. So this is something that Dropbox has been trying to do for the last 7 years, something that Box has been trying to do for the last 7 years. Now, I don't want to say, I don't want to say never, nothing. I don't want to say that something isn't possible, but my sense is that if it had been possible, it would have happened by now, and that basically all of these different cloud-based file sharing providers have figured out other ways of delivering a reasonably similar experience. And you kind of have to just accept whatever caveats go with whatever solution you end up picking. Or you stay with your on-premise file server. We've had organizations where everybody who works at the organization works out of a single office. They have no business need to access their files after they leave that physical location, and the organization of the file server is working well for them. In that case, the solution, as antiquated as it might seem, is meeting their business needs, and there's no reason for them to bend over backwards to try to move their files out to the cloud just so they can say they have it out in the cloud. Now, there's other considerations that go along with that, solution design. How are those files being backed up? If the organization suddenly has a need to access files remotely, then the file server is going to start to create a lot of problems for them. So I mean, long term, it's hard to imagine that 20 years from now, people are still going to have file servers on premise. But at the same time, it's a solution that still works for a lot of organizations. So that's this is just the balancing act you have to take into account when you're thinking about this. Kind of goes all the way back to the beginning when we were talking about the design considerations and the design strategy for moving to the cloud. How ready are your staff for a new way of working with files? How how well does this new way integrate with how you're currently working with files and with how people are currently working with each other? Those are really the questions that you need to ask. And so it's not a simple, straightforward answer, but if you address it in a methodical way, you're likely to arrive at a solution that really meets your needs. All right. Well, thank you all for your time this afternoon. It was a pleasure to have you on this webinar. I hope you found it useful, and we look forward to your joining us next month for our webinar on crafting IT security policy. Take care.